Alright, hello everyone, Simon here, and welcome back to our ARCHMINE100 series where we learn about architectural concepts through Minecraft. So this is the third video, the second lecture, and we're going to talk about interior-exterior. Or I guess it's more accurately shelter that we're going to be talking about, but the relationship between an interior and an exterior, of course, having an interior means there must be some sort of shelter, otherwise there's no inside or outside. Let's go in and we'll explain this as we look at some of these pictures and their diagrams. So if you look back at human prehistory, we see that caves are some of the earliest shelters for humans. So you see here the cave paintings in France, which kind of proves that people lived in these caves, right? So the most basic purpose of architecture is to shelter. That's just what architecture does, right? Why do we build buildings? Because we don't want to be outside. We want to be inside. And early humans took shelter in caves. But as technology advanced, we constructed shelter wherever we went. So early humans would go to caves, but then we started building houses and so on and so forth. So some of the things we built can still be seen today, really, but as some examples of shelters, we have the Native American teepee, which is like a tent in a way, with animal skins covering a structure underneath. The Mongolian ger is similar. You have animal skins on a timber frame on the inside, and both the teepee and the ger are portable, and because these are nomadic people, so they didn't stay in one place. They would follow the herds of animals around, and so then they moved a lot, and so they had to have temporary structures. That's not to say that all human structures were like this, but you can imagine the earliest ones might be like this because they're lightweight, they're kind of simple to make. Although they're quite, I mean, I say simple to make, but actually if you look at them closely, they're quite well designed. But they're relatively simple and they're lightweight and they're kind of relatively easy to construct in terms of the materials and the methods. And on the right hand side here we have igloos built by the Inuits. So they would take blocks of ice and they would kind of construct a house out of the ice. And the thing about the ice is that once you put the blocks of ice together, what they would do is they would melt a bit of the ice in the cracks, and when that freezes over again, then the whole igloo becomes completely airtight, which is pretty amazing. So I mean, because it's sub-zero temperatures outside, so these things would just stay standing up until the season passed, and so you build ice. You think you're building houses out of ice. What? Well, then they just melt. Well, no, because it's so cold there that it doesn't melt. And they were quite effective as houses. So you basically just kind of take blocks of ice out of the ground and you build with it. So these are some of the I guess it's okay to call them primitive. I mean, they're not, they were, as I said, if you look closely at the construction, there are some very clever things they do with the construction. But these are some of the examples of primitive, shelters that we know about. Obviously, a lot of these things would have been in the distant past, and we might not actually have examples of them left. Let's not ramble too much, but there are other kind of construction methods that we know about, but we don't see in the world anymore because they're old and, but they're quite interesting if you're interested, just to, go to Wikipedia or you find some books about prehistoric buildings and how they built stuff. More recently, we have detached houses like the North American bungalow here to the left. It's quite a popular type of house, like it's an individual standalone house for a family on its own plot of land. So bungalows have been exported around the world. I guess as the Europeans colonized different parts of the world, they would kind of copy the bungalow in different parts of the world. And the detached house is quite popular because, I mean, for one, it is relatively small and relatively simple, so it's not too expensive. But then it's nice enough, for you to feel like you have your own home and you have your own garden and all that. So it's a balance between affordability and having all the stuff that you really want in the house. Whereas on the right-hand side here, we have some condominiums in Singapore. So in more densely populated places in the world, then we start to build bigger and bigger structures with more and more apartments or units within the same structure, just because we want to fit more people into the same space, right? Because we don't have enough land for 7 billion people now we have in the world, and still growing. So these days you can have these kind of big apartment buildings as well. But the idea is the same regardless of what form these shelters take, is that we want to be indoors. We don't want to be outdoors all the time. I mean, you want to be outdoors sometimes, but you don't want to sleep outdoors. You don't want to work outdoors. That being inside has an advantage. So why is that? Let's talk about just kind of shelter concepts. So the first example we have here is just a line on the ground. So imagine that there's two people here. There's a square literally drawn on the ground, the green square, and there's a person inside and a person outside. And you might look at this and think, well, how is this shelter? It's a line on the ground. But a line, it's okay. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's not much shelter, but it delineates space. And as an example, if you think about roads, what stops cars from crashing each other on the roads? Well, really, it's lines on the ground and the fact that people understand what the lines mean and they don't, go into the opposite side of the road and smash into the other car. So if people understand what the lines mean and they respect what the lines mean, then lines are a sort of shelter, or they can be a sort of shelter, like roads. And the fact that cars, stay in their own lanes and don't crash into other cars. Cars do crash occasionally, so it's not completely safe, but as far as it goes, it works because people understand what the lines mean and they're willing to respect them. So that's that's a line on the ground. It doesn't do much, but it can be quite significant in the kind of shelter that it affords, as long as people respect it. So slightly more shelter. Here we have an example of a low wall. So the person inside the green square is still not all that separated from the guy on the outside. So it's fairly minimal shelter. But now there's a wall there, and you don't accidentally cross that wall now. Like if you want to go inside that green square, you kind of have to climb over the wall. I mean, there's nothing really stopping you from climbing over the wall, but it's more you don't accidentally cross over anymore. Whereas in a road, people seem to quite often accidentally crash their cars because there's nothing really stopping cars from crashing into each other. Whereas here, there might be a bit more stopping people from trespassing into that space. Although again, it doesn't do very much. It doesn't really do very much. It might stop some, I don't know, small animals or maybe a bicycle or something, but not much. So here we have a higher wall. So now we're starting to get actual shelter. So climbing over a high wall is quite difficult, although if you're determined, you can still do it. More importantly, though, you'll notice that now the guy on the outside can't actually see the guy on the inside because the wall is taller than him. So, he can't actually see what's going on inside. So it provides visual privacy. And that's important because, sometimes you don't want people to see you. Maybe you're naked. Maybe you're doing something private. Maybe I don't know what you're doing. But you don't always want people to just kind of see everything you're doing, right? So this provides visual shelter. I mean, you're still exposed to the sun and the rain and the winds and whatnot. And if the guy outside is really determined, he can still climb over. But if he's relatively respectful, then he doesn't see what you're doing. So that's an extra layer of shelter, right? And then the next one here, we have like a raised plinth, which is an interesting thing because what this does is, if you imagine a balcony, this is like a balcony is like this. So a balcony means you're above the other person. And what this provides is, interestingly, it provides asymmetric visibility. So the person on top of this plinth can see down very easily. But if this person steps back, then the person underneath can't see him. So imagine if you're in a balcony, like if you kind of lean over the railings of the balcony, then yes, they can see you. But if you step back, then they can't see you. So the person on the inside has a choice as to whether they want to be seen, but the person outside doesn't have a choice. So you have this asymmetry of visibility. I don't know if you can kind of imagine that clearly, but if you imagine a balcony, like the person who's on the balcony can choose whether he is seen or not, but the guy on the ground can't choose, which is different from this scenario where neither person can see the other one. Like the guy outside can't see the guy inside, but the guy inside also cannot see the guy outside without climbing over the wall. Whereas here, there's the choice and the asymmetry, right? And then here we have, what people usually think of as an actual shelter. This is a room. We can't see the guy on the inside anymore because he's like completely enclosed with walls and a roof. There is a door there, or a doorway. There's no door in the doorway. But a room is essentially an artificial cave. It's it protects you from the sun, from the rain, from the wind. It's fully enclosed, and you're protected from pretty much everything except for someone barging through the door. So this is what people usually think of as shelter. But this is total shelter. Whereas the things we've seen before now, they're partial shelters. And just because a partial shelter isn't a complete shelter doesn't mean that it's not useful. A lot of times it is useful if you don't want to keep everything out. And by thinking about the difference between the partial shelters and the complete shelter, we can see kind of some of the more subtle details of what shelter means. Do you want to keep people out? Do you want to maintain privacy? Do you want to keep the weather out? Do you want it to rain on you or maybe not rain on you? And things like that. You can choose, like every one of these things you can choose. I mean, if you want to see outside, maybe you can add some windows to this room. And you can add some curtains to the windows so that if you want to see outside, you draw back the curtain and you see outside. And people can see inside too. But you can close the curtains and then you can't see anything, but they can't see anything neither. So, you kind of add these things to your shelter to selectively allow some things in, but keep other things out. Like if you have a window, you let the sun in, you let the light in, but you don't let the rain in unless you open the window, right? So you can choose to selectively keep things out or let things in. And that's really the nature of shelter. A shelter is not just a complete shell to block everything out. You don't want to block everything out. Like you want the sunlight to come in sometimes. Or you want to travel outside your room sometimes, so you don't want to lock yourself in. So it's a selectively letting certain things in. Not blocking everything, but blocking some of the things you don't like, while letting the things you want inside. And then here we have a pavilion, which is just a roof with no walls. So this one is a variation of some of the things before. Whereas here we have walls but no roof. The opposite is the roof with no walls. And here this is a pavilion. It protects against the sun and the rain, but people can walk in and out freely. So you're protected from the weather, but you're not protected from other people. So it's kind of useful in a different way. So again, you can choose things that you want to keep out and you want to let in. And that's the important thing about shelter. It's not just keeping everything out, but choosing what to keep out. So here for some more concrete examples on variations of shelter. This is the Palazzo Medici in Florence, Italy. So on the left here is the exterior view of this thing. You see that it's a stone building. There's 3 stories, and there's pretty small windows. And then on the right side, we see the interior. There's an interior courtyard in the Palazzo Medici, and so the courtyard in the middle is open to the sky. And then there's this arcade, or a cloister, you might call it, around the interior that's quite open. So the air and the sunlight can come in, and even rain can kind of come into the courtyard. So why is it like this? Well, the Medici were a notable family in Renaissance Italy, and they were quite wealthy and quite influential. And they also had some enemies, some political enemies. And back then, politics was occasionally violent. And so this house was basically a fortress. I mean, it's kind of a fortress. in the sense that if your neighbors started disagreeing with your, political policies, they might actually come try to burn your house down. That kind of stuff happens every now and then. So you see the exterior view on the left there. It's like a fortress. It's a stone fortress, and it's like a completely flat face. It looks almost like a prison in a way, because it kind of is like it kind of stops people going in, and it's supposed to serve as a fortress. So it is quite difficult to attack it from the outside. But then when you're inside the house and you're being besieged by your political enemies, you don't want to be just kind of stuck inside. So on the interior, it's open to the sky because you want to, you want some fresh air maybe, or maybe you just kind of just go for a walk in the sunlight. You can't go walk outside because there's guys on the outside trying to kill you. So you go for a walk in the courtyard where it's open to the sky and you're not kind of stuck indoors all the time. So here we have this idea where there's a very solid exterior, but there's an open interior because it's safe on the interior. So you're letting the sun in, you're letting the rain in, you're letting the fresh air in, but you're keeping your enemies out. So you see this kind of selective shelter, right? The next example here, I don't know if you can see it very well, it's very white. This is the Farnsworth House in winter, so there's kind of snow on the ground. And then there's this glass box, which is the house itself, and then there's a ceiling and a floor, and the whole thing is raised off the ground. I don't know if you can see that very clearly in this photo. Hopefully you can see it. So, what kind of shelter is this? So the extensive glass windows gives you quite spectacular views of the countryside. And you can see there's like kind of trees, and it's on a floodplain, so there's close to a river. Occasionally it does flood. So the giant glass windows just lets you see in all directions around you. So the views are amazing from this house, right? You can see everything from this house. But the house itself is raised above the floods, or they try to. So it's raised off the ground because occasionally the place floods. And it's kind of raised upwards so that you reduce the number of times that the flood actually gets into your house. So what you want to try and do is keep the house above the floods. The house has still flooded a few times in history, so this doesn't work all the time. But most of the time, the stilts keep the house above the water. So, yeah, as a shelter, you want to keep the snow out, but you want to let the views in. So the big glass windows. The problem with the big glass windows is that it doesn't insulate the house very well. And as you can see, the winters are very cold here. So there's massive heating bills in winter because the glass doesn't keep the heat in the house. I don't think it's double glazed neither, so it's actually very inefficient. It's kind of you waste a lot of money trying to heat the house and not let people freeze inside your house. And there's also minimal interior walls. So as a whole, there's great views, but there's no privacy. But it is on private property, and the private property is quite large. So the idea is people aren't supposed to be there anyway. So on your own private property, where you have this kind of large floodplain, this is like a holiday home where you kind of have great views. And if it were triple glazed, then it wouldn't have the heating problem. But again, you can see the selective shelter here. You want to keep the weather out. You want to keep the snow out. You want to keep the flood water out. But you want to let the views in. So you're not keeping everything out. You want the views, but not the other stuff. And then that resulted in a house design like this, which is like a glass box that's elevated above the ground, where you can see in all directions. And this is a petrol station, or what do Americans call it? A gas station? I'm sure you've seen stuff like this before. So this is another example of a shelter. So there's a roof, so it shelters from rain and maybe sun. But you see that the lower bits are completely open because you want to let cars drive in and out freely. Because if you want to fuel cars efficiently, you need the cars to move in and out quickly, right? So again, selectively blocking rain, but letting cars travel through. And also, I guess, letting the space be ventilated too, because petrol is quite dangerous if it's in an enclosed space, because the fumes can be ignited if you're not careful. So the large, the fact that there's no walls means that it's constantly ventilated, and so then you don't get the accumulation of petrol fumes. So again, selectively choosing what to let in and what to let out. So you want the fumes to get out, you want to protect the people from the rain a little bit, and you want the cars to move freely. So again, like, thinking about what to shelter and what to let through. And if you know about your petrol station histories, the earliest petrol sellers were actual pharmacies, and you bought petrol in containers over the counter, like you buy medicine, or like you go into a supermarket to buy petrol. It's kind of like that. Not really a supermarket, but you go into a store to buy petrol, and that's obviously not efficient because you park your car outside and you have to carry a can of petrol to your car. Whereas today you just kind of drive up and then pump it directly into the car and then drive away again, which is much more efficient, right? So petrol stations evolved into this form because it's effective, and it makes more sense than trying to sell petrol over the counter, which is what they did when cars were first invented. So for the second exercise, it's the shops there. You can see to the right of our city there. You are given foundations and furniture for 2 shops, a cafe and a general store. So the orange bit there is the general store. The brown bit there is the cafe. You are to build the sheltering elements to complete the buildings, namely the walls and the roofs. So you have the floor and you have furniture. Your task is to build the walls and the ceiling and the roof to enclose them, to make them complete buildings. You should not move the furniture. Like, if you really, really want to move the furniture, I guess you can. But the point of the exercise is to challenge you to not move the furniture and try to figure out how to make this thing work. If you want to move the furniture a little bit, you can. But it's the whole point of the challenge is to not move the furniture and see if you can figure this out. The simplest thing to do is to just put the walls around the boundary, right? Because I've given you the foundations there, the brown wood foundation and the orange wood foundation. You can just put walls around it, but that's not necessarily the only thing you can do. So try to kind of think a little bit and try to be maybe a little bit creative as to where you put the walls, just so that you're doing something interesting and not just the easiest thing. Think carefully about doors and windows and skylights because, as we said earlier, you don't want to keep everything out. You want to let the light in, and you want to, if they're shops, you want people to be able to see what the shop is selling, for example. So you don't want to just enclose the whole thing and then people can't even see what you're selling. So, think about the cafe, think about the shops, think about what you want to let into these buildings and what you want to keep out. And you may want to add interior lighting. Actually, you probably should add interior lighting, but that's a slightly different consideration. All right, and that's the images licenses. Again, that's like a legal requirement. So is there anything I should recap before we finish? No, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I think the key point here is to think about, don't think about shelter as just a shell or just an enclosure, but think of it as selectively keeping out the things you don't want, but letting in the things that you do want. And in every aspect, every sense, I guess, light, sound, movement, people, wind, all of these things, you can let them in or you can keep them out depending on what kind of things you want. And you design the shelter and you choose different strategies to achieve different combinations of shelter depending on what your needs are. Alright, let's end this here, and in the next video, I will do my example of building the shop and the cafe. I'll see you there.